Welcome back to the program, and I know my guests will be very pleased to see we're joined again by Alex Krainer, market analyst, author, and also former hedge fund manager. So thank you again for coming on the program.
Thank you for another invite, Glenn. Always good to join you, and warm greetings from Monaco to your viewers.
I want to discuss some of the policies which are being pursued, which seems to be leading to a more or less a strategic defeat in several areas. And again, I guess the central theme here is the concept of self-harm. I don't understand really the policies anymore, but it does appear that part of the source behind this might be the political propaganda, because we often find that framing is a very important part of propaganda. So, for example, if we look at the issue of the war in Ukraine, then we say, well, whether it's about sending weapons or doing diplomacy or sanctions, everything is always simplified and dumbed down to a binary position of a good moral position versus a immoral position. And so we see that if we're going to send weapons to Ukraine, we do not discuss the key issues. Will it escalate? Will we have escalation control? Will this lead to a direct war, possible nuclear war? Will it have more casualties for Ukraine? Can it lead to an actual favorable negotiation position? No, all of this is put aside. Instead, if you're for sending weapons, you're pro-West and pro-Ukraine. If you're against, you're a Putinist and probably a traitor. And we do see the same with diplomacy and negotiations. That is, the point of departure is not a open discussion about what supports or undermine our security interest. Instead, is if you're for diplomacy, then you're probably with the Russians. If you're against, then you're with us. And again, we have the same with sanctions. What can be achieved? Can we diversify? Can Russia diversify? These are the questions we should ask. Instead, we are accepted to accept all sanctions. Then you're good. You're with with your own people. You're supporting Ukraine. If you're against sanction, then you're with Putin. This is this is the intellectual depth of our discourse at the moment, which also applies to Middle East, the trade war with China, European integration, I guess most of our foreign policy. And I guess my hypothesis here, which I wanted to discuss with you, is the extent to which this is causing some harm to our interest. And I guess on this topic, though, I wanted to ask you, what are you watching at the moment in terms of on the U.S. side and the European sides? Well, what kind of policies do you think are, well, I guess directly counterproductive?
Well, very nearly everything that the European side is doing is counterproductive, but we have to, these things are neither surprising nor unpredictable if you correctly diagnose what is the nature of this conflict and who are the stakeholders at the opposed sides. And so, as you and I have discussed it before, it's the conflict between two systems of governance, and that is basically the conflict between the European oligarchic imperialist system that is always directed towards creating colonies and basically colonial plunder, opposed to pretty much everybody else, including the domestic populations of Western European countries. And then we have to understand who the stakeholders are. It's the money-lending oligarchies who are driving this neo-colonialist system of governance. And to them, not only Russia, not only China, Iran, other Middle Eastern nations, but all of humanity to them is prey. They are the predator and everybody else is the prey. So, in order for them to preserve their hold on power, their dominance and hegemony around the world, they will absolutely willingly sacrifice the domestic economies and societies of Germany, France, Great Britain, the United States, Canada. It doesn't matter. So as they're failing to score victory in Ukraine, which is pretty much, I think, their number one priority conflict, battleground in the world today, they are doubling down more and more and more, and they are depleting the domestic societies where they are based, right? They're host societies. So we see the economy of Germany, of France, of Britain, of the United States, Italy, and so forth. They're absolutely collapsing, and the people they have put in power absolutely don't care. All they talk about is Ukraine. All they talk about is going to war to Russia, against Russia. And so that's not difficult to predict. That is, the obvious thing that they will do, because they don't have a different business model. They're not interested in reverting to managing individual sovereign nations as, independent, neutral economies and societies, and crafting policies around improving the standards of living and prosperity and employment and industrial output and all of these nice things. We see that in Russia, we see that in China, we see that in other places, but across the West, we are uniformly slipping into something that looks more and more like naked fascism. And so everything is subordinated to the interests of the banking oligarchies and to their corporate clients. And so this is, now the outcomes are becoming undeniable, even though the symptoms were there for several decades, whoever wanted to pay attention. And then I think that all of those people who think that we are the good side and that the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians and so forth are the bad side, I think that we've come to a point of biblical inversion. We were warned, woe to those who call good evil and who call evil good, because they are creating a lot of these evil outcomes. And then, another warning was from, I think, was it Goethe, who said, none are so so blind as those who willfully will not see the truth. And I think that people who are close to power in Europe and in the United States, to a large extent, they deliberately don't want to see the truth. They want to persist in this path of self-destruction, and they will go until either the system collapses or they're taken out of power by popular revolutions.
A key country, though, I mean, if we look at the country that was defined as the economic powerhouse of the European Union, which is, of course, Germany, it's often pointed out that how tremendous the political changes, economic as well, has changed. This was the country that had transcended its history in terms of the use of military force. It's now, of course, it's again fighting a proxy war against Russia. They're saying Europe is at war with Russia, according to Merz. Economically, there also seems to be some economic implosion coming our way. If the opposition, the largest opposition party, even some polls, the biggest in the country, is being criminalized, talking about banning it. I mean, it's a very peculiar direction for Germany, given that, what Germany looked like only 5 and 10 years ago. What do you see happening in Germany?
Well, I think that's very difficult to predict because obviously, so long as they persist in the current policies and they don't make any course adjustment, the economic situation is going to continue to deteriorate. The government's fiscal position is going to continue getting worse and worse because, as the country becomes deindustrialized, and more and more people are losing jobs, and then there's secondary effect because when these large industrial companies shut down production, then there's there's a lot of small and medium-sized businesses that depended on these companies and their employees, restaurants and cafes and all kinds of small businesses that depended on the purchasing power of the employees of these. So it's almost like a self-reinforcing cycle that is ultimately drastically reducing the government tax receipts. So their fiscal position is deteriorating, and then they're going to have to raise more debt in order to continue functioning. But as the economy is imploding, the interest rates are rising. So it's becoming more and more expensive for them to fund the government operations. So, I think that if you had responsible leadership who looked to the benefit of their nation, they would say, we have to change course. We have to make nice with the Russians. We have to repair the Nord Stream pipelines to make our industries competitive again. We have to restart our nuclear power plants to have more abundant energy production so that our industrial output is more competitive. And we have to reverse European Central Bank's policy of culling small and regional banks in order to consolidate the whole banking system under several banking behemoths like in Canada and the UK. But all we hear is Russia, Russia, Russia. They're not even addressing any of these problems. They even ignore when their national interests are being threatened directly. Like Poland will not extradite the individual who is suspected of blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline. Of course, nobody believes that he did it, but maybe an investigation and a trial would bring us closer to the fact. And then the Polish courts just simply said no. Merz goes on TV and he's talking about Russia, Russia, Russia again. So the result is then that the people are switching loyalties from the traditional parties, the SPD, CDU, to Alternative für Deutschland, AfD. And so now you're coming to the point where actually the class war is the most hotly contested conflict in the nation. And now the established parties and their sponsors are trying to find every way to stay in power and to prevent the AfD from coming to power, because AfD is the only one that's offering a substantial change in policies. And then we're getting very bizarre reports about 7 or 13 AfD candidates dropping dead in a space of 2 weeks just before regional elections in Rhineland-Westphalia. Of course, these things are not explained, they're not discussed. People are just supposed to pretend like nothing is happening and move on. But even for a country of very disciplined, conformist people who are very reluctant to upset the social order by in violent ways, or to step outside of the bounds of law, even they have a limit to their patience and how much they can tolerate. And this is why some social scientists are predicting that European countries are going to descend into a civil war, into revolutions. And to go back to your question, I think it is impossible at the moment to predict whether the unraveling of this crisis will take place because the incumbent parties are going to be swept out of power by, through democratic institutions and democratic means, or if we're going to have social uprisings and things going completely off the rails. That is impossible to predict. What we can predict is that the current policies, the people in power are going to double down on the current policies, so they're going to stay unchanged substantially, and that the economic situation will continue to deteriorate. And then at some point, probably in not very distant future, there's going to be a, what they call an absolute event, something like the collapse of the Lehman Brothers, something that's going to suddenly catalyze the crisis to very acute proportions, because now the crisis is there. People are generally aware of it, but because nothing really happens from day to day, everybody thinks that the current situation can continue indefinitely. Well, nothing blew up today, so probably nothing is going to blow up tomorrow. But the farther this go on, the closer we are to a kind of a blow up that nobody will be able to ignore anymore. And then we're going to be finding out what the consequences of this crisis will be.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary where the focus is, because a common criticism now against many European leaders, be it Starmer, Merz, or Macron, is that their focus is solely on foreign policy. Not even foreign policy, it's on Russia. This is it.
Yeah.
And they're not really attending much to domestic issues, which is a bit problematic, given that most of Europe now is undergoing some economic stagnation or decline. We're having deep trouble in terms of getting cheap and reliable energy, which is then further causing deindustrialization. We don't have any technological autonomy. Again, over all these years of referring to Western tech companies, we forgot that all of the Western ones were actually American. And who would have thought that America will look after themselves? They have other interests, and it did, as we now see the U.S. Accepting more and more multipolar reality, which means that they can't prioritize Europe the way they did in the past. So we're kind of stuck in a more vulnerable position, especially as the U.S. becomes more, more extractionary, or seeking more tribute as a way of recovering. You can add all these other things like declining birth rates, social instability, democratic decline. But, with all these problems piling up, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, Robert Fico, he made the point that, whenever they attend any meetings with the European Union, it's just every order is, Russia, second Russia, third is Russia, and this is it. This is all they're going through. And I think today even the Swedish Swedish defense minister, he came out. I'm not so sure if you saw this post, but he said the experience of Sweden living next to Russia was that they had to always fight for freedom. And this is why they needed to increase their military. I mean, that's not their experience. They lived next to Russia. They chose neutrality, and they didn't have any conflicts with them. I mean, this is it's very strange. I heard the same from the Finnish, because they also have to have a NATO narrative, and their experience was you can't make peace, but that's what was the foundation of their rise. And again, the Swedish defense minister made the point that we need all of Europe has to go into war mode, because we have to have a powerful deterrence against Russia. But usually deterrence means you deter the opponent from taking aggressive actions. But it seems like we're deterring Russia now from aggressive reaction as well, because in the same breath, he wants to steal the Russian sovereign funds. He wants to seize the Russian ships in the Baltic Sea, so-called the Shadow Fleet, advocating for long-range missiles supplied by the West, likely operated by Western countries, to strike inside Russia. But we have to deter the Russians. This is also why we need... I mean, it's really crackpot crazy talk here, but I guess, yeah, towards this end, I very much agree. I think something's gonna crack, something's gonna blow up, but either we're gonna end up in a direct war with the Russians. For some reason, they expect this to be our tank columns versus theirs. I don't think they foresee that Oreshniks will, rain upon our cities. But putting this aside, what would you look for the alternative? If it's not war, then as you said, we can't continue like this. Something's gonna crack in the economy. Do you have your eyes on any specific indicators? I mean, talking currency problems, stock market? What are you looking at?
Well, I think that I'm primarily concerned about the bond markets in Europe. The British and European bonds, German, French, Italian, and British. Germany is the largest economy in the European Union. France is the second largest economy in the European Union. Their fiscal position is, as well as the British one, they're in a catastrophic state. They've all gone. Well, France has gone beyond 100% debt to GDP, and I'm virtually 100% certain that the numbers that we know are probably also false. That the situation is much, much worse. For example, when Keir Starmer came to power, then they made the whole theater about how he discovered a 22 billion pound black hole in the government's accounts. Except when he was in opposition, he was talking about first, I think, 36 billion pound black hole. And then some months later, he was talking about 67 billion black hole. And then after that, he immediately corrected himself and he said it's not 67, it's 76. So when he was in opposition and he was, they were looking at these figures to attack Rishi Sunak's cabinet, they knew the number. It was $76 billion black hole. As soon as he was in power, suddenly the black hole shrunk to 22 billion without any explanation. And so I think that we are being deceived by authorities in France and in Germany and elsewhere. And so the situation is absolutely unsustainable and it's deteriorating. It's only getting worse. The people who should be trying to mitigate the crisis are completely absent without leave. They're completely as you said, it's all first Russia, second Ukraine, third defense spending, fourth Russia again, and so forth. There's no discussion about improving competitiveness. Mario Draghi, more than a year ago, wrote a report about European competitiveness. And since then, nothing much has happened. You said correctly that all the Western tech corporations are in fact American tech corporations. Americans have a stranglehold on high technology in the Western world. And Europe not only doesn't have the corresponding contenders, they have even made their life so miserable that the ones that do emerge from out of Europe eventually end up moving to the United States. Like for example, Spotify. Spotify was a very successful European venture, started in Sweden, and they remained for as long as they could. And then in the end, they said, sorry, but this is ridiculous. We're moving our business to the United States, where the system is much more hospitable to successful entrepreneurs. In Europe, if you're a successful entrepreneur, you end up punished for your success. In the United States, you get rewarded. So in the whole European system is practically now it's devolved to self-imposed headwinds. And in the end, if Europe continues like this, it's going to become a tourist resort and a museum for visitors from around the world, which is something. But you're not even going to have that if you think your most important project now is going to war against Russia.
That's this excessive, I guess, reliance on the United States is not helping the Europeans either. And if I was advising the United States as the world becomes multipolar, I would tell them, you should focus on the important regions, so Americas, Asia. So you want to pivot away from Europe, but still you want to make sure that Europeans keep their economic loyalties to America, because in a multipolar world with many centers of power, you want to capture that market. So not so much spending money, but making. So make sure the Europeans keep buying American tech, energy, weapons, and whatever money they might have left, and make sure that they commit themselves to investing that in U.S. industries, not their own continent. Now, obviously, this is a disaster for Europe, so the main escape would be, besides strategic autonomy, also diversify our economic partnerships. So I would then tell the Americans, well, make sure that the EU doesn't have other partners, sever them not just from the Russians, but the Chinese. And you to some extent see this happening now as well. You probably followed the Nexperia case, which is the the Dutch government seizing control over a Chinese chip manufacturer at the as the reporting proves or suggests, at the behest of the United States. The Americans pressured the Europeans to seize the Chinese company. China now retaliates, and you have this split. And now we can only get their chips from America, essentially, if we continue down this path. I mean, how do you see the Europe getting involved in this trade war with China? I just as a last comment, I do see some problems there, that if all the Chinese exports to America is being cut, that yes, they have to redirect it some places like Europe, which could cause, I guess, excessive supply if it's, pressuring down prices. I can understand why, which is why you would want to sit down with the Chinese and try to come up with an agreement how to manage these turbulent times. But that's not what we're doing. We're seizing their companies now, much like we seized the Russian funds. So we're not really an appealing place to do business anymore. How do you see this? Well, why do you think the Europeans are going not after China only, but also India? This is quite. It's I don't know, as Europeans. So this is that makes no sense to me at all.
No, it doesn't. And I think that European economies hardly have any partners. Either they do business with countries towards which they try to impose an almost neo-colonial dependency, or with more powerful countries, they put themselves in a completely subordinated position, and they will violate their own interests. They will violate international laws. They will do anything if, let's say, a country like the United States tells them to do. Whereas, Kaya Kallas will go to China and to India and Ursula von der Leyen, and they will not hesitate to lecture them about values and about how they should manage and what they should do. Is like they don't remember that not so long ago, European powers were colonizing all these parts of the world and left complete and utter devastation there. So I think that for Europe to turn the page, it will be absolutely essential that we purge the system of the vested interests that are in power today. And again, we're going back to the banking oligarchies who have taken the whole continent hostage. And at that point, I think that Europe will be able to improve its relations with the United States, because the United States does support parties like the AfD, and I think that if the AfD got to form a government in Berlin, that Germany's relationship with the United States would improve. You would still have a problem that you'd have to negotiate for your interests. They were not going to be handed to you on a silver platter, but at least you could argue your corner and obtain certain constructive concessions from the United States. They would also be able to improve their relations with Russia, which is absolutely essential. Russia is our neighbor with the greatest treasure trove of natural resources anywhere in the world. And if you want to develop your economy, you have to make nice with them. You have to negotiate a constructive, mutually beneficial relationship with them. And then Europe also has to overhaul their relation to the global South, where we, didn't hesitate to subject them to colonialist plunder, basically. Like, for example, France imposing their own French French franc type currency on their former colonies, purchasing gold from them at massive discounts, purchasing uranium ore from them for $1 a kilo, when on the open market the same resource cost between $100 and $200 a kilo, and keeping them in a perpetual state of underdevelopment and poverty. So we have to I think, reinvent our own identity, decide who and what we want to be, what we want to represent in the world, and then craft a policy for the future accordingly. I think that Europe has a lot to offer to the world, but it has to be done in a way that's respectful of others, that is upfront and constructive in relation to every individual country, and then things can be improved little by little. It's not going to happen with Friedrich Merz in power and Emmanuel Macron or Keir Starmer, but with some future governments, it will happen eventually. And then I think the logical step will be to join the BRICS, or Eurasian Customs Union, to cooperate with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization for Mutual Security Pact, and then things can improve. If we continue to follow the current policies, I think that the outcome will be similar as the outcome for the Western Roman Empire. You go down the same road to perdition until everything is broken and you practically have no capital left to turn things around.
Yeah, I do think that part of the obsession we have with Russia is not just that it has a unifying effect, hopefully, to have a common enemy, but it's distracting as well from all of these problems, because there is no solution, which they have proposed. I keep trying to find out what actually they're looking for in terms of recovering Europe's strength or relevance in the world, but there's really nothing there. It's just a hope that if the Russians can be defeated, then somehow we can go back to the 90s. But the central question of how Europe should learn to adjust itself to a multipolar world, where it's not the sidekick of the United States in collective hegemony. It's there's no discussion towards this end. But uh, but in terms of the banking crisis, though, uh, is it the debt which is worrying you then, or
Yes,
debt
yes.
bonds?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the fact that our debt overhang is unpayable. This is not an unprecedented situation. This is a logical consequence of the very fraudulent monetary system that we have in operation, not just in Europe, but everywhere in the world, pretty much. And so the debt overhang in the system is well, the public debts are almost everywhere over 100% of the GDP, but when you add private debts to it, you come to levels that are 350% of the GDP. That's absolutely impossible to pay those back, and that's by design. And so you have the situation where the productive part of the economy has to work harder and harder and harder just to service the debt to the financial sector. And the financial sector is hoarding all this money, and it's investing it around the world wherever. It's not investing it at home for improvement of the infrastructure, investment in productive economy, industries, and so on. It's investing it in wars, in blowing asset bubbles in Europe, in the United States, in Japan, wherever, it doesn't matter. And so in the end, you have this, not just the debt, the regular debt that is owed. You have also quadrillions of derivative exposure that is within the financial system. So the whole thing is completely unsustainable. The problem is that these situations, as many times as they happen through the past, and we see the same symptoms repeating them again, and we know that we're close to the precipice where, you're going to make one step forward, and that step you're going to fall into the ravine. But we don't know when that happens. We cannot make that prediction. But the fact that people are increasingly aware and increasingly worried about it, you can read it in the price of gold and silver, which has almost doubled this year. Gold was close to $2,000 per ounce at the beginning of this year. Now it's over $4,000 per ounce. And who knows where the price of gold goes. And this reflects people's loss of confidence in the government, in the financial institutions, and in the currency which they're using. We're going to have high inflation, and that inflation will probably tend to accelerate gradually to hyperinflationary levels. And at that point, I think the whole social fabric begins to unravel. And then you're going to have, if it doesn't happen before then, you're going to have governments falling, social uprisings take very dangerous proportions, and maybe even war against Russia actually happening, World War III.
Well, when the European Union first began, it had a lot of logic behind it, which I would have supported. Again, the whole idea, especially of collective bargaining power. You have all these countries coming together by removing some of the borders, removing some of the borders between them, and similarly, it gave this extra competitiveness. Uh, but but again, in these days, you don't get the impression we're really under great leadership in the EU. I mean, Europe these days are represented by the likes of von der Leyen and Kaya Kallas. So it's not part of this seems like a leadership problem, and of course, it's problematic to have people like Merz who have too close ties into the finance industries, and you have to question at some point what national priorities actually play a role. But if you look at the EU today, I don't see any talk about how do you build a Europe for the future. Where do we get our cheap, reliable energy from? How is our path to technological autonomy in the reindustrialization in terms of developing also our own digital ecosystem? How can we have credibility and strength in our banks, currencies? How do we avoid a rent-seeking oligarchy? And what foreign partnerships are required to achieve our objectives? There's no means or ends, or I mean, it's quite shocking to listen to the politicians these days speaking, which is one of the poor leadership is also why I'm curious what future the European Union can have, because it seems to have taken on a very different purpose than the initial. Do you see the EU being, I mean, going down in flames with our economies?
Oh yes, absolutely. I think that's only a matter of time. It's true that an acute leadership problem, because all our leaders, all the people who are near the levers of power, are absolutely low caliber leaders with very little competence, with very little integrity or charisma. But this is by design, because people who hold the real power make sure that anybody who would attempt to reform the system, who would attempt to change policies, that they are immediately eliminated from power. And this can take place in many, many different ways. Usually it's character assassinations. Now we have lawfare, which is very often used to eliminate candidates like Calin Georgescu in Romania, like Marine Le Pen in France, and so forth. Then you have actual real assassinations, which is, there were 2 attempted against Trump. There was 1 attempted against Robert Fico in Slovakia. And then, you have other types of elimination, like Jeremy Corbyn in Britain, who was character assassinated as an anti-Semite, basically because he wanted to take a more balanced approach, not even the pro-Palestinian, not even an anti-Israeli, just a more balanced approach to solving the crisis in the Middle East, and he was eliminated from British political life. Then, even in the military ranks, I remember before the war in Ukraine started, I think this was January 2022. There was like a defense-related event organized in India, and NATO commanders were in attendance there. And there was a meeting held in India between German generals and the Indian defense personnel. And one of the Germans there was Admiral Kai Akim Schonbach or Schonbaum, I forget. Well, he was an admiral of the German Navy, so had a lifelong career in the German defense establishment. So a very, very competent, qualified person to be there. And then in this meeting, he was saying, well, the low-cost solution to the problem between Russia and Ukraine would be for us to acknowledge Russia's security concern and to have respect for them and to find a solution that is mutually acceptable. Well, the admiral's career was ended that very day. You see, so anybody who goes outside of the Western groupthink of we have to go to war against Russia, we have to eliminate nuclear power plants, we have to not buy any natural gas from Russia, we have to end burning fossil fuels, all of these fixed ideas that have been imposed upon us. Anybody who wants to think outside of this imposed framework is almost immediately eliminated. And they're eliminated in a very hysterical way. And the result is that even those among our leaders who can look at the writing on the wall and read it, they choose to remain silent and to parrot the establishment talking points because, they know that if they speak the truth, they will be eliminated. And so anybody who is competent, anybody who has a shred of self-respect and integrity is not even in the ruling lineup in Europe. So as a result, you have Ursula von der Leyen, you have Emmanuel Macron, you have Kaja Kallas, you have Keir Starmer, people who are completely hollow suits, who, if they're told tomorrow that everybody in Europe has to, I don't know, wear pink hats, they will pass a decree forcing everybody to wear pink hats, and they will say, well, if you don't wear a pink hat, then Russia is going to win. There's no, we're at a stage where they will defend the idea that 2 + 2 is 5, that slavery is freedom, that ignorance is strength. We really are there. And how do you change that? I think the whole system will have to crumble into its footprint, and we're going to have to start over.
Yeah, no, it doesn't seem like there's any serious solutions being proposed, at least not from our political elites here in Europe. But my last question, though, I wanted to ask you about this upcoming meeting between Trump and Putin. Well, first, I guess what led to this I thought was quite interesting because, as we know, Trump suggested that if Russia didn't fall in line, he would send out tomahawks, which well, it can't really overstate how dangerous this would be, as this would be a U.S. operated missile. That is, this would be the United States under the Trump administration launching long-range missile attacks on Russia. It would not be launched by the Ukrainians themselves. No one even pretends that this would be the case. Also, it could carry a nuclear warhead, and the Russians have said, we don't know if a nuclear warhead would be attached. We will act accordingly as if it is. So if we followed what happened during the Cold War, if the Russians think that they're under nuclear attack, this is not what you want the world's largest nuclear power to think, that they might be under a decapitation first nuclear strike. Anyways, what I thought was fascinating is Trump called President Putin. He says, they have a talk, and after the talk, they decide, instead of going up this escalation ladder that could lead to nuclear holocaust, they agree, let's meet in Hungary instead. And the reaction from the Europeans is horror. I mean, it's for me, it's unbelievable. Like, they're actually taking the steps towards nuclear war. They're able to walk this back. And the only response is that Trump is also Putinist, because he's not willing to, die at the altar of our virtuous, jihad against Russia. I mean, it's just beyond obscene. But anyways, I guess, Trump is no saint. I think he's a very, very flawed, indeed very flawed human being in general. Also, I think if he could keep the war, burning slowly, and the Europeans would, pay America for it, the Ukrainians would do the dying, and Russia would be weakened, I don't think he would be opposed to it. But I think he sees the writing on the wall. This is coming to an end. Let's finish it in as favorable as possible, and let the Europeans carry the cost of this, which is a fair position for the US to take. But anyways, because he has this anti-globalist bent to him, and it's I mean, this seems it's very sad that Trump now is our best chance of ending this in a peaceful way. But what do you expect from this meeting, though, between Trump and Putin? Because even if Trump wants what he claims he wants, he still faces a lot of headwind back home in Washington from people who do not necessarily want to end this proxy war against the Russians.
Well, yeah, exactly, Glenn. Because it's not. We're not looking at a clash between monoliths. United States versus Russia, or United States versus the European Union, or anything like that. We're talking about a clash between vested interests. Some of which are in the pay of the banking oligarchy, and others which are against the banking oligarchy. To me, it has been very clear, practically since Trump's first term, that he is opposed to the banking oligarchies. And I have to put in the caveat, at least the European ones. I don't know, the situation in Venezuela is going to tell us whether he's subservient to the American banking oligarchies, to JP Morgan and Rockefeller interests. But he's definitely on a warpath with the European banking oligarchies. That much is clear, which is why I never really believed that he changed his policy towards Russia and Ukraine, because Russia, in this case, is his most logical and obvious partner. And so cultivating constructive, positive relationship with Russia is too important to play around with, because if he escalates against Russia, he's helping out the European financial oligarchies. Next to no upside for the United States, next to no upside for him and his government, and a massive risk of nuclear annihilation. Whereas if he cooperates with the Russians, there's no downside at all, almost, and a huge amount of upside. And if Trump is one thing, he's transactional. So he's looking at, well, Russia has all these resources. They have a very large market. They are, at least in purchasing power parity terms, they are number 4 economy in the world. It's so much better for us to be cooperating with them and doing business than going to war against them, which is not even in the US interests at all. And so this whole pivot that Trump apparently made, I thought was a deception. And I think that part of the deception is because he's getting so much pressure from the European partners to, come back on board, don't abandon us, daddy, please, give us security guarantees, give us the weapons and the intelligence and the logistical support and all these things. And Trump thought, like, okay, I have a whole lot of junk weaponry that I could sell you guys for top dollar. So maybe I'll just tell you, hey, yeah, you can win. Just be sure to buy the weapons from us. And then he, at the same time, he makes his own military industrial complex happy because the Europeans are going to be spending hundreds of billions of dollars on US made weapons. So, he gets to weaken the Europeans, make his a huge and powerful constituency at home happy, and the whole thing is fake. He's not really interested in going to war against Russia, and I think he never was. It's only when it came to the meeting with Zelensky at the White House that became obvious and undeniable. And I think that Europeans, if they fell for that deception, it's because they are now so desperate that they're eager to believe whatever it is that they want to believe. And so I think that the meeting in Hungary is interesting for a number of reasons. It's NATO territory. It's European Union. The fact that Vladimir Putin might come to Budapest for the meeting with Trump will, among other things, enable Viktor Orban to purge the most dangerous elements of his own opposition at home. Because why? He will have a cover of having to prepare the country to host this meeting and making sure that nothing goes wrong, that, because there's high risk that Trump might get assassinated or Vladimir Putin might get assassinated, that his plane might get shot down. So I think it will give Viktor Orban an opportunity to really purge particularly the security establishment inside of Hungary, and to introduce maybe new elements of security in their place. That will make it much less risky for Hungary to one day say, okay, we're out, we're exiting, without there being a risk to his own personal life and security, to his party, to his government, and so forth. The possibility of a military coup happening in Hungary instead to prevent exit of Hungary from the European Union and from NATO. So that's one important element. But also, I think that Hungary's position is going to improve if Russia takes the whole coast of the Black Sea. And I think that with Trump's blessing, Russia is going to go in that direction. Blessing meaning we're not going to oppose you, that's fine. Because then Russia takes control of the Danube's exit into the Black Sea, and that opens the trade routes to the landlocked countries of the Central Europe, like Austria, Hungary, Serbia, Slovakia, to have an opening into warm ports from Europe and towards the BRICS nations and the multipolar integrations. So from the strategic point of view, I think this could be a heavy blow to the European Union and to NATO. And I think that's almost a done deal already, because otherwise, why would Trump and Putin be meeting in Hungary? There's always a message in the choice of where they meet. They could have met, they could have organized it in Istanbul or in Minsk or something like that. They chose Budapest for a reason, and I think that it's going to accelerate the collapse of the European Union.
Yeah, I was thinking as well, it does seem to have a, well, you can argue that that the Hungarians have been more at the forefront in terms of pushing for some diplomacy, because this has been boycotted by the rest of the Europeans. But this being said, it's also this wider issue of Orbán being seen as belonging outside of this liberal globalist class, which also Trump very much has a personal disdain for. I said also, I actually had one last question on top of that. We see also that the Europeans are now moving ever closer. There's some reports that a deal might be close in terms of, I guess, legalizing the theft of Russian assets. They're now talking about actually not just freezing them or stealing the proceeds, but actually stealing the assets themselves. And I'm not sure, pay off their own debts, skim some off the top, send a lot of it to the Ukrainians. But either way, this is your neck of the woods. The financial aspects of all this. What do you think would be the consequence of this if the Europeans would actually do this? Because, for example, France, which has been opposing this, Brussels, they do recognize that this could be, on the theme of today, an incredible act of self-harm, extremely stupid one as well. Why do you think it would be so dangerous to go through with this, to start legalizing theft?
Well, there's the obvious element of showing to the to the whole rest of the world that they are bad faith players, and that you can't accept, that you can't expect European financial institutions to play in good faith, and that you can you know rely on those relationships. That's obvious enough. But second problem will emerge, and I think it already is emerging, is that once you've stolen the assets, who gets to spend them? Who gets to use them? And there's going to be very bitter recriminations around there. There already is, for example, this is not even about Russian assets. This is, for example, a whole feud that erupted between German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and Ursula von der Leyen about defense spending. So, they all agree that they want to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on armaments and on the militaries, but they can't agree how and who gets to spend it, because whoever gets to spend it gets to receive the kickbacks. So Ursula von der Leyen wants it to go through the European Union institutions. Friedrich Merz wants it to go through German institutions, and they went from being friends and political allies to being in an ugly family feud. And if you throw stolen assets into this kind of a mix, where you've already stepped outside of the bounds of law when you've stolen assets, so now all the legal, let's call it the legal framework about how you can use tax receipts or newly issued debt or whatever assets you have certain legal framework. Now you're going into uncharted territories, and you're going to get a feeding frenzy by rabid hyenas that's going to erupt, and is going to go everybody against everybody, and it's going to get really, really ugly. I would say with the possibility of assassinations that could become rampant in among European politicians and decision makers. So I think that if they take that step, and I think that they are now desperate enough that they will probably not be able to resist the temptation, and they will sideline those who tell them that this is a horrible idea. I think that the consequences are going to be some form of a very ugly karmic justice.
It's a terrible, I guess, omen or sign that this is the main plan for economic development in Europe, stealing the assets of another country, and of course, after giving some to Ukraine, lining our own pockets, the rest is supposed to be laying the foundation. I mean, it's
Yeah.
and the fact that they're moving along now, doing similar tactics with China, it's also, yeah, deeply, deeply concerning.
Yes.
Anyways, any final thoughts before we wrap it up?
Well, just on this count, I think, imagine for a moment that that all went well. They stole Russian assets, and they all agreed how to do it, how to spend it, who will spend it. Everybody says fine, and they're all friends. Well, this is going to create a huge temptation to do it again, because then how fantastic. And then you're going to be looking for pretexts to do it to China, to do it to India, to do it whoever has the biggest balances. So you're absolutely going to send people running away from you. It's a really curious form of collective suicide that they're pursuing, but I think it's born out of incompetence, out of desperation, and out of ultimately the whole system being in the hands of pirates. Really, the money lending oligarchies in London and in Paris are literally heirs to pirates. The system kind of evolved by accretion from the practices of privateers and those who funded their adventures, and the slave trade. And so little by little, they created a legal code that can be tweaked to make whatever you want happen.
And just the icing on top, though, is really how they convince themselves that they are on the right side of history. That
Oh yes, of course.
all of these mad policies are, in the service of stopping Hitler of today. It's it's very frustrating because
Exactly.
it's such a
Yeah.
stupid way for Europe to destroy itself. I mean,
But it's a typical bully story, when the bully brutalizes somebody and then says, like, look what you made me do. We're the good guys. It's the Russians are so bad, they're making us do all these things that otherwise we wouldn't, of course. But
anyways, thank you so much for taking the time, Alex. It's
thank you. Thank you, Glenn, for
very frustrating to read the news these days.
Yes, it definitely is. But and nothing lasts forever. Many empires fell in history of mankind, and so will this one. So what we have to do is make sure that we survive, that we keep our humanity intact and our heads on our shoulders, and that we are ready and able to turn the next page when the time comes for that.